Okay, so yes, if people want to just unmute themselves and speak, um, please do, or just put a comment. There's a comment come up at the bottom of the screen. This speech is this presentation is going to be about autism, grief, and loss, and I'm breaking it down into different areas which are related to autism. So alexithymia, which is to do with emotional processing, language processing disorders. Then we go to social perception, so social and motor agnosia, visual verbal agnosia, sensory perception challenges, and mentalizing. And where we go. So let's move this. Right. Yeah, there's just a slight delay in my presentation. So when we look at alexithymia, that has around an 80% crossover with autism. Some say higher, some say lower, but it's over 50% with the highest being 80%. And breaking that down, it's to do with processing one's own emotional state. So delayed in self-emotional states, delayed in self-emotional awareness. And we're looking at this idea of the person having monotracked systems, so systems that run along a single thread. So if we think about a situation where someone has died or passed away, the environment is what it is, and depending where the person is, whether they were present at the person's death or that they were there, or whether they've been told by a family member or a friend, that starts off a processing, internalizing system. And that happens with anybody, but contextually with autism, if alexithymia is part of the package, it could take a very long time to get recognition and awareness of how one feels. And this could lead to lots of miscommunication or misunderstandings from other people, thinking that it may be to do with a lack of empathy or a lack of emotion, literally, when actually what's happening is the person hasn't got the awareness of how they feel about that current situation. So recognition may take far longer, and recognition is an awareness of your emotions. And if it's slower in between the act and the actual recognition, it's this in between time where the processing is slower. I know I can remember when my auntie died, my great aunt died, and I went to the funeral, and I was there physically, obviously, and I saw her get buried in the ground. You know, that's the way it went. And it took me around half a year in terms of process to recognize she died. So in that time, in my mind, she hasn't died yet. I've been through all the environmental signifiers that she has. I went to the church. I obviously saw family members. I saw her buried, etc. But it was a drip effect in terms of recognition. And with alexithymia, not only do you get this delayed recognition, when recognition finally occurs and finally happens, you can get emotional regulation. And emotional dysregulation could be an overwhelm at this sudden awareness of feeling. Donna Williams described it as a bucket in the corner of the room. The bucket would existentially fill up, and then it would slosh or over, which would cause this dysregulation. With me, it was very similar, but I almost described it like a tsunami of emotions, or a tsunami of feelings that would just envelop me, and I would go through bouts of self-harming, hitting, slapping, until around the ages of 18. And that was my way of trying to deal with not only the recognition, but the intensity of the emotion. Because between that time, there appeared to be nothing. There appeared to be no awareness of what was going on. But actually, pre-consciously, pre-intensively, it was all going in. Are there any questions for that before I move on?
Not at the moment, Paul.
Not at the moment.
No.
So the next is language processing, and there are different levels of meaning deafness. So processing information around deaf and loss. So it's effectively about internalization, internalizing through language what is going on, and this could mean that you have the way you present the information is significant. I can remember recently meeting up with a friend in Oxford, and she was speaking about someone she supports, and the way in which this lady reasoned out her, because her mum had passed away, my friend's mum, the way that she reasoned out about her mother was to hark back to things she'd watched. And this is a discussion I had with the person's father, where she obviously, this is to do with Gestalt perception and language. So what she's taking in about a certain event is fixed. So she said about, you know, your mum is in heaven now. And that harks back to the conversation with the father, where when she was inquiring about it, she was talking about angels and harps and things like that, because these are things that she saw in the cartoons. When people would die, you get this imagery, this sort of pseudo-Christian imagery of angels and harps and clouds. So that can also have an impact on association. Another gentleman I worked with who had Fragile X and autism, he lost his grandma, and it took him a whole year to process it. So that was how deep that was. And what he would point at through association afterwards was blue. He would point at things that were blue, like baby blue, and would go grumpy. And this is because he'd got an association: heaven, sky, blue. This is how he internalized this information. And bearing in mind, when for him, the final piece of the puzzle was actually on his birthday, and he realised that Grant hadn't sent him a present. And on that day, the mother relayed back to them, the day centre I used to work with, you know, he's been crying all day, pointing at pictures of his Grant, and in terrible distress. So what I'm talking about here is similar to the alexithymia. Language, what the person has been accustomed to through their early years, will internalize. And that is with any child, but in particular with people with language processing challenges, there will be things that come out that may seem a bit blunt or untoward, but actually it's the person trying to reason out what is going on, and how they feel about it may come later. So these two things are kind of linked. I can remember an example of talking to a gentleman about the death of my gran, and we were in the car, and we were happening to talk about relatives and family, and I said, you know, my gran passed away some years ago, and he, as quick as I said that, he said, "Do you miss him?" And I said, yes, I do. I do miss him greatly. And he actually kind of acknowledged the sadness potentially that I was feeling, which was very moving. And there's another situation with a gentleman who had a different type of presentation in terms of language, where he struggled with interpretive speech effectively and was more profoundly meaning deaf than the other gentleman who asked me. And you had to break down the language. He's intelligent. Imagine a bottleneck. So there's loads going on, but the bandwidth is much smaller. And he would say, words about it. I remember this gentleman who'd been a big part of his life had passed away suddenly. And he'd known him for many years. So the way in which the gentleman was reacting, you had to be mindful of what he was trying to piece together. It was very fragmented. So he's going deaf, coughing, in the ground, etc. All those pieces of language and trying to make a connected extraction. So you may have to be mindful and almost put yourself on a back burner that you may hear things that potentially some people might be quite distressing if they're not used to someone talking in a certain way. It may be a case of people being educated around the person. Well, this is how the person is trying to decode, disseminate, and use what language they have to their disposal. When I was younger and much more meaning deaf than I am now, when I went to my aunt's funeral when I was around 12, I had no idea what was going on. I interpreted it vividly. There was no kind of awareness or consciously. I was shifting from one space to another. We went to the house, we went to the church, and it was all in bits. I could feel sadness from everyone. That was very prominent, but I couldn't necessarily marry up what the sadness was, where it was going, what was it about, despite all the pieces being laid before me. And that was a mixture of other things. But if we're looking at it from a language perspective, yes, it wasn't happening. I was upset, I was sad, but it was coming from the realm of emergence rather than the realm of interpretation. So we just have to be mindful that there are different levels of meaning deafness within someone's autism profile. Are there any questions about that before I move on? Anything?
Nothing at the moment, Paul.
No. So the next aspect is to do with social emotional agnosia, which is, in its most simplest terms, it's social perception. It's a non-verbal learning disability or a non-semantic. Also, it's other interchangeably spoken about as the semantic pragmatic disorder, etc. There are many words for this, but in a sense, what the underpinnings of it are a person who doesn't perceive facial expression, body language, or hear tone of voice. So they're potentially literal in their understanding and processing, and may need a structured way of filtering information. So on the other side, you've got a person who may breaking down of language and may be more pattern theme feel. You may need to use objects of reference, gesture, etc. For people with social emotional agnosia, you may need to use lists and factual. If there's a factual perception of an emotional event, that might be quite hard to do. And I give the example of my my father and I recently wrote a blog about empathy with these different systems. And my father has social emotional agnosia. And I'll give you an example of how that works. And it is around grief. This was when my grandpa passed away, and my mum was on the bed crying because obviously she's grief-stricken that she's lost her father. And my dad came into the room, dusting and cleaning. Obviously, non-verbally, my mum was conveying grief, sadness, loss, etc. And he went out of the room and appeared to ignore my mother's needs. And that wasn't happening at all, but that's, you've got to take in account both sides. So she come downstairs very distressed, saying that this is what's happened, and it appears like he doesn't seem to be aware of the emotional situation that I'm in. So I said, hang on a minute, I think we need to sort of sit down and work out how to help bridge communication and open up empathy. And I said, why don't you go back up there and everything you're feeling emotionally convey in a list-like form. So she went upstairs and said, Peter, I feel like this because of X, Y, Z. And we'll go in this list-like form. And sure enough, empathy was shown. But the difficulty is, in certain situations, the person may not be reading the room at all. So that can bring about its own challenges for the person. People with social emotional agnosia, it's common for them to have social anxiety because of this. And if you imagine going into a room and not being able to read people in a way which creates spontaneity, or having to overthink situations because they're not coming innately. Think of a situation, a funeral, someone who's grief-stricken. It may be seen as a lack of empathy, but actually it's to do with information processing. So again, it's about self-education, or educating yourself or educating others. Depends what angle you look at. If you're worried about one of your children who may have this, going to funerals, there may be a risk of what the person being blunt or appearing not to have tact. But it's a reflection of how they're perceiving the information around them. So visual verbal agnosia. So they may struggle with written information, may struggle to create a connection between what is being written and the semantics and how they're feeling. When we think about funerals, you do in different cultures as well. There's written information, either from books, prayer books, religious books, hymns, songs, etc. And of course, filtering this information is about conscious thought. And it may be that the person actually struggles to meaningfully internalize language. To give a context that I worked with a gentleman many years ago at school, and he used to echolately back off what was on a page, but it took him far longer to actually internalize what was actually being said from the inside. So what he actually felt about it, the words to use about what he felt about it, etc. So again, it's looking at these different types of mono-track systems. And if people struggle with the written word because of this perception, it may be that you have to be creative and think about other ways to connect information. Could it be that you may have to use objects of reference, so using different objects and then creating a world around them to fill gaps that the written word, for whatever reason, isn't doing? And it's garnering an ability to connect and using creative tools to work parallel with person's system. So in effect, that's what I'm doing for this whole presentation, is garnering reflection of how one can work with someone's system. So sensory perceptual challenges. What if we're dealing with someone who may be object or meaning blind, and they may have a kinesthetic associative learning style, and they're still living in the sensitive system as opposed to interpretive, and that's got nothing to do with a lack of intelligence. It's where the person is developmentally, it's where the person is from an information processing perspective. So filtering information, if they filter it like a deaf blind person, where they have to touch and taste and sound and smell and use other sensory modulations to gain meaning, that may be crucial in things like closure. That may be crucial in things like emotional needs, filtering an emotional need. I can give an example. When I saw my gran at the Chapel of Rest. Yeah, there's a message. I'm just going to read. Oh yes, thank you. Making lists for some people be very, very because with social emotional agnosia, a lady just messaged me. What people, you can get what is called an egocentric reaction to a situation. So someone with social emotional agnosia will see themselves in a situation. Do you understand what I mean? So if someone sees themselves constantly in a situation, I mean literally themselves. So when they look at something, they relate that to themselves. When they look at that, they relate it back to themselves. And this is where it gets construed as they're lacking empathy, they don't seem to be aware of other people, etc., etc. It's about, what if the person wants to see other people? What if the person wants to connect? What if the person internally is a very social person that sees this as a great barrier or a challenge? You've got to be mindful and get the balance right between difference and disability. Sometimes it's a mixture of both. So with social emotional agnosia, to aid and garner with a different perspective or a different take on the situation, yes, you would offer lists and different perspectives. My father has this challenge a lot. It's to do with shared sense of social, and shared sense of social starts around in non-autistic children around 5, 7, or 8, and as late as 9. And this shared sense of social is the ability to extract and receive in real time. But what I find with some people on the autism spectrum is they can do all self, no other, all other, no self. So so all other is thinking about my thoughts and extracting them to someone else, or someone talking to me and I'm thinking about what they're saying, but they can't do both. And it wavers to varying different degrees. You also get in people with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, with or without autism, schizoid personality disorder, with or without autism. There's some personality types that garner that. In fact, onto that, I was on the bus coming home from Oxford, and there was this little girl who had exactly that. She was around 5, and she appeared not to have social emotional agnosia, and she was very precocious but very clever, and she was talking to her father for a good quarter of an hour about how she would change the bus into a hotel, which was very inventive. But the language and the dialogue that she was using was akin to an adult, which was very interesting. And she carried on you know, breaking down the bus and what parts of the bus would be what, etc., etc. And what the father was doing was going with her perception and going with her imagination. It was quite interesting and moving to watch. So yeah, you have to work with the person's system. So going back to what I was saying about my grandfather, I saw him in the chapel of rest, and of course I'm not a visual associative thinker, so how am I going to say my final goodbye? And he, you know, he's beautiful in my opinion. He looked beautiful, he looked at peace, he looked calm, he looked like he was sleeping. And I'm fully aware that doesn't happen with all people. Sometimes, I'm sorry to be frank, but the body has begun to decay, and sadly, if you leave it too long, they have to work to the body, and sadly, that's actually what happened to my grandmother. And I'm glad I didn't see her. She just didn't look like Gran, or in the case of what my mother said, she just didn't look like my mum. So I'm glad I did. I sent my hospital rather than going there. So with my grandpa, I thought, well, this is the last time I'm going to physically be able to see him. I don't retain information. So I sculpted his face, and that's how I said my goodbye, stroked his hair, and felt his face. So that gave me an ability to start branching out of closure, not closure in sort of literal sense, you know, you get over it, you move through it, rather than, I think we incorrectly use words about grief like you get over it eventually. I think you move through it and learn to live with it, because let's face it, or it gets easier. I don't think it does for some people, because each day that person's not around, each day longer that they're not around. So with each day that passes, it's they've been dead longer. So is that really better? I think we need to work on language about grief, and I think it's fear-based language. It's the person saying that to you may not want to go there. And I think culturally in the UK we have a pretty reserved and unhealthy relationship with talking about death and sex, it seems. Creating life and the end of life seems to be a problem. But anyway, that for some people that would be a meaningful way to connect. And it may seem odd and strange and peculiar, but it's about working with that person's system and effectively what works for them. And in a sense, that is what it's all about. This part of life, philosophically, isn't meant to be easy. It's not meant to be. It's not meant to be an easy road to travel. But what hopefully helps, or has helped in this presentation, is understanding that there are different variants of the word grief. There are different ways of experiencing grief. There's different ways of communicating grief. There are different ways of experiencing loss, and equally there are different ways of remembering people who have passed away. There's no set rule, and I don't know if the right word is enjoyed this, but I hope you've been informed by this workshop, and the audio problems aside, I think I'll just speak out the laptop in future, or get another pair of headphones. But anyway, if anybody would like to inquire with questions or would like to book me for places, because I realise a lot of parents listen to me. So if you've got schools around the local area, that's initially where, before these presentations, a lot of my work was around schools and education. So Tally would be able to share my email address. I shall stop sharing and I shall go on to question and answers.
Thank you, Paul. That was excellent. It's a difficult subject, but That was really, really helpful. Thank you. And what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get, because the audio was still not 100%, I'm going to try and get it transcribed, and then we can have the what you were saying written underneath, because it's such an important subject. I think it's worthy of doing that. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Paul or any comments?
Oh, thank you, Lisa. Yeah. Yeah.
Please unmute
And you
yourself.
can unmute yourself and speak.
That's Claire.
Sorry, Paul. Yeah, just to say, there were so many things that I hadn't factored in. There are the typical things like sort of, kind of language-based challenges around kind of death and grief, and and kind of the flowery language that we often use around death. Those are things that I kind of ponder on, quite regularly in my day-to-day role. But there are so many things I hadn't even considered could impact upon, someone's kind of experience of grief and death. So it's just really insightful. Thank you, Paul. It's always helpful.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
My name's not Huawei. My name's not Huawei. Sorry, I had to quickly download Zoom, and I was rushing, so I didn't get to put my name. I'm Kelly Farshai. I was just it's very interesting because my son is quite a visual learner. He's 15. He's got a severe learning difficulty, and he's autistic. It's quite interesting because when my dad first passed away last March, and Lewis was very close to his granddad, it's the first person he's lost that he's had a real bond with. He knows that there's this mysterious place called heaven where a lot of our family and pets are. He hasn't really got a visual image in his mind of what heaven is. Like Paul explained about the harps and the clouds and everything. I don't think Lewis really has an image in his head of what heaven is. And he knows that Grandad's gone to this mysterious place called heaven, and that means we're never going to see him again. But when my dad first died, we were very literal with him, and there was no beating about the bush saying he's gone to sleep or anything like that. It was, he had cancer, the doctors couldn't fix it, he died, he went to heaven, he's not coming back. But that's where the literal bit kind of stopped, and I'm kind of wishing now, should I have taken him to the funeral, should he have seen the whole process? I can kind of redo that because I've got photos of the coffin, I've got photos of the urn being put into my dad's memorial with the ashes in it and everything. So we can kind of sort of address that and show him pictures of the process. Do you think that's a good idea? It's really hard because you're constantly trying to protect your children from something so emotional, but actually for him, I think he's finding it so hard to accept that Grandad is not coming back. He will not allow himself to accept it. He keeps asking for him, keeps hoping that if we go to certain places like our old address, that Grandad might be there. If we can go back to Nanny and Grandad's old house, maybe he'll be there. It's like that acceptance he's really struggling with.
Yeah.
So any advice on that?
Yeah, I think, so internalizing to start the grieving process off, I suppose you have to firstly be aware that it's actually happened. A person has died and passed away, and then that sets into motion, they call it the 5 stages of grief. One of them is denial, where your nervous system goes into shock and just cannot believe that this person, you're not going to physically see them again, which is common. I mean, it's a human. I think that's
yeah.
It's a human thing. I know with my mum, when her dad died, I remember hearing her downstairs just wailing, and and it was a simple thing. It was putting his cardigan in the washing machine. It smelled of him. It's very, I'm sure you can relate. When you look at stuff, oh my god. And I suppose it's a fear that someone's got to go through that, which is understandable. That pain. Sorry for making people upset.
That's fine.
It brings back memories, doesn't it? And I can understand as a mother why you want to protect, because it is a great pain, grief. But at the same time, there's another way of looking at it, which is if we want one to be a part of the world, this is part of life, isn't it? That one day people die. And it's about normalizing it, isn't it? And I wonder if our culture has a big, it's not just an autistic thing, it's how, for example, my nan and grand were brought up to fear death, don't talk about it, and they were children of war. If you're children of war, you imagine what they were hearing on the radio. It's all about, we've got to survive, we've got to live. And my grand didn't accept dying until his very last breath. He died standing up. And I shouldn't laugh at that, but I think it's actually oddly quite a nice man, because he kind of went how he lived. But that showed how he processed it quite powerfully. He didn't want to talk about it while he was got the prognosis. So I'm just mindful of that if you start, I can understand what you're saying. If you start up a process where your son can begin to grieve, to start grieving process, and actually go through all the motions in his way, because it may not be the same. Starting off that process, it may have hit home about Brad Deluxe, where they kind of waited a year, and it was only on his birthday that he thought, oh, right, okay, so he is not here. And it many months, this gentleman, to kind of process it, because he would have bouts of depression anyway. And he came back, and I think it was just about having support around him while that process was happening in his mind. Yeah. And also, as peculiar as it sounds, but it may not to others, it may not to you, but to have memories, pictures, sensory memories, maybe there's objects of reference. I kept my grand's cat, and one of the reasons why I kept his cat was because it had his hair. I could feel it had his white hairs in the cat. It smelt of him. Yeah. Sweat, oddly enough, but that almost made me feel close to him. Yeah. He loved gardening, so there's lots of associations there. You can look at art. I done a bit of art therapy on my own. I didn't have an art therapy, so I started drawing and trying to get these emotions out about how I feel about loss. I don't know how his writing is. If it's not an avenue to go down, you can try other things. And it's working with the system and kind of also managing your own grief of someone grieving, if that makes saddening. Yeah. Seeing someone grieve is quite, maybe you need some help as well, through someone to help you, knowing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because Lewis really struggles. He really feels people. He's a very sensitive boy, so he can't, if I'm upset about something, he can't really cope with that. And I think it's because he doesn't understand, why a person is crying. Is it something to do with him? That kind of thing. So I've kind of not really cried that much or shown him that I'm grieving. I have at times, but not very much at all. Is that something? Do you think he needs to see that?
Well, I've spoken to. I know Tally will relate to that. The system of sensing. It sounds like where your boy is, and the system of sensing. I do a specific workshop on that. Is everybody starts off, just to give you an idea what that is. It's quite complex, but I'll break it down. The system of sensing is what all human beings start off of. It's when the nervous system is completely naked. You've got no association, no cognitive association, no cladding, no hierarchy. You're just being. It's the only state you could argue a very stressful person is being a Buddhist or Zen. You know, you're just merging with the environment. And some people on the autism spectrum retain the system of sense. They merge with people. And they merge with people. You can't hide anything from the system. Someone who's living in a system of sense, you can't hide anything. And I know Tally and I've had it. You can't, with Taryn, you can't hide sadness from Taryn. You can't hide anything, particularly negative emotions.
I think you're right. That's really interesting.
And what emergence is, will I tell you, I know people's trauma. I know before they know, and if they do know, I know very deeply as soon as I clap eyes on them. Some people may call it clairvoyance. Some people may call it soothsay, you know, years gone by, soothsayers, which is warlocks. And I merged with people. I knew someone's hands before they come out. I knew someone's, you know, friend. I know when people are ill and when they're not. I know when, you know, my mum went through cancer. She had cancer scare in her breast, and I knew the test negative. It's all about energy and cells. If he's got the ability to merge with your emotions, what may make him emotionally dysregulated is he cannot unpick what is his emotions and what is mum's. And that's what I go through. I go through what I call a state of dissonance. So when I get a person with intense trauma or intense emotion, I'm living that emotion. And that is what, and Tally will then, you know, Aaron's similar, isn't he, Tally? Is he similar? Yes, she's nodding.
Yeah,
and
very much so. Yeah, definitely.
So and actually, people with fragile X are very sensitive anyway. So this dissonance they cause, you know, the one you love is the one that gets hit, the one that gets bit, and they're not literally hitting or biting you. They're scared of what they're feeling. Yeah. It's almost like a fear response.
It sounds like you're describing my son.
Yes, it's funny. I was speaking to a man today who's very aspy, and you can see it on my Facebook. We were having this dialogue, and he was struggling with these two systems where you've got the more aspy types who are logical and literal, and you've got the more sensing types. And we had the message privately, and it's quite lovely. He is one of the most empathic men I know, but the way in which he reasons empathy out is the opposite of me. in sort of social emotional agnosia, where he doesn't perceive it, but he's empathic. He cares. So, but the people I work with through the years are the ones that, like your son, who, let's face it, in the autism community, they don't get spoken about near enough. You don't see blogs about them. And it annoys me on a personal level, because if you want it to be about the whole autism spectrum, you need to talk about these people who are living in the system. Talk about these people a bit more. I'm all for the people who you know, go to university, who are highly, you know, do you understand stereotypical intelligence, I call it?
Yeah.
The ones that, let's face it, if we have people who think, why can't we appreciate people who feel more? Yeah. You've got to have both. and that's why I get on more with women. I've realised now I get on more. I get on more with females because I think that emotional attunement, and it, you know, like when I speak to Tally, it's very different conversations when I speak to my father, completely, or my male friends, because there's something about emotional attunement that's there in the conversation. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That is, people who are sensitive men, there's all stereotype about if you're male and sensitive, this is a problem. It isn't really, But hopefully that makes sense. It's called the system sensing. It's emergence, it's pre-attentive thinking, it's someone who is filtering. Imagine going into a room and feeling every person, not literally. Let's take that out of context, worrying statement like that. But what I'm saying is you're feeling their energy, right? And that's what overwhelms me. If it's not the environment physically, then it's the environment emotionally. And then you get blocking behaviours. So Ali spoke about it Sunday. He's blocking, he's trying to create distance. I can't cope. So when it comes to grief, I can understand completely how that will just create a lot of hyperarousal potentially and dysregulation. But I don't want to sound flippant. It may be worth it in the long run. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, sorry, you've frozen.
And it doesn't get enough. So you're living with these sensitive people, and you are that more knowledge needs to be known about the system. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does help a lot. Thank you. And it makes an awful lot of sense because of his anxiety, his emotional bucket overflows a lot.
Yes.
He's now on antipsychotic medication because he's really not coping very well at the moment.
Yeah.
And you factor in everything else with his hormones and lockdown and things that have changed so much, including himself. And our parents getting older. And my husband's dad has been recently diagnosed with dementia, and the stresses that come with that, and he's feeling all of this that we're all going through right now. And my mum, the real connection to my mum he has as well. It's almost like when my mum's going through anxious time, so is Lewis, and the same for me. And you've really explained my son well there. Thank you.
It's emergence. And I guarantee he's probably not. He's most probably not psychotic. He's just living in a world where logic and it's a sad situation where logic is king. You've got to be linear and logical. Logic has its place. And there's beauty in logic. I think it's all to do with gaps in knowledge in professionals. Really, why sadly this happens. Now, I'm not a medical man. There may be a very good reason why it's on antibiotics.
Yeah, it's more to do with his anxiety and the fact that he's struggling to. He gets so dysregulated and has those massive meltdowns. And as he's got bigger, he has started to go into fight-flight mode when he gets so overwhelmed. So he's attacking now. So it's more to take the edge off of the anxiety. Which it is helping, but he's very OCD as well, and that's kind of gone up a gear in the last couple of years. And he's just really struggling. I think that's why they've put him on that. We are looking down avenues of sort of therapy as well. They're going to try out a differentiated form of cognitive behavioural therapy with him, and try and do some visual bereavement support with him as well. So he's all the professionals that are working with him. So fingers crossed we might get to a point where we can take him off the medication because he's got different ways of managing his emotions. Fingers crossed. Yeah,
and also the professionals that are working with him will have to work with his system. Absolutely, from day one, they'll have to work. They can't go sort of, I've had it before I was diagnosed. And it's no fault of the professionals, but they kind of say that isn't the way you do it. As soon as you start saying it isn't the way, that's not how you learn stuff. And I thought that's what gave me a net until recent few years until I met some nice. They're not bad, they just didn't understand me. I can rationalise that now. Just make sure they work completely with his system.
Absolutely.
That's all I would say.
That was one thing that I was going to bring up to them at our next meeting, is the fact that they're, making this plan based on lots of reports, but not actually on knowing him. but the lady that's going to be working with him said that the first, you know, period of time working with him will be trying to connect and build a rapport and get to know him.
And if they're, and I'm going to be blunt with you, if they're shit, if they're psychopaths, if they're narcissists, and if they're abusers, he won't open up to them.
Right. Okay. Okay.
That now, because I picked them up. I mean, if I had £1 for every person who I realised with one of those 3 things, I'd be a millionaire. So,
Really?
Oh yes, I picked them up. They don't hide from me. They're too superficial for my liking. So that's a quality that he has. If he's ever in a situation where he's in an educational setting, residential setting, whatever, and he is uncomfortable, it could be anything. So sift out all the environmental issues first. But if it's to do with a particular person, I'll give you a quick story on that, because I thought it was absolutely amazing about the late Donna Williams. And a friend of hers, Stella Waterhouse. Now, Donna went to do some consulting at a care home, and Stella had to go out for a moment to take a phone call. And Donna was in the room with a resident and a member of staff. 2 minutes later, Donna came out the room and said, that staff member in that room is an abuser.
Oh,
because
really?
it's a system of sensing. She merged with that person and she informed Stella, no, don't do it. And I had the same feelings when I was at a care home. One of my first jobs at a care home. All the staff were awful. They didn't need to tell me they were awful. I knew that as soon as I clapped eyes on them. And they saw me as very threatening because, of course, I connected with all the residents, and that was met with jealousy. That was met with, I'd actually talk to the residents like people, as opposed to, things you cart around. So that, I don't know if that's quite scary, but it's something I've known ever since I was young, that this unknown thing about danger. If people make me uncomfortable, there's usually a good reason. So if your son is, and this is for the future really, if you pick up that your son around certain professionals is acting differently or displaying sort of responses that aren't best, what's the word I'm looking for? That aren't best sort of resolved through, like, it may be the environment, then maybe it may be worth looking for a different professional.
Okay.
I don't want to slate professionals.
No, not at all.
Professionals being bad people, but bad people go into good jobs, don't they?
Yeah.
Let's be honest, they do.
Yeah.
And professionals, they're damaged because, let's face it, they've got unresolved issues, and I've seen people like that where that rather than understand, it's odd, isn't it? Why would you do this job? But the psychology, I think, it is, they're so broken that they don't want to accept, so they try and help others through control and coercion. It's a power dynamic. I remember working at school many years ago, and there was a teacher who used to behave like that. My hackles used to go up all the time with her, and guess what? She's threatened by me because she knew I was on to her. Yeah. So these highly sensitive people, it's all the time. So when they're really calm around someone, that means that you are calm. Yeah. You are balanced. You are grounded. You are centered. It's almost like being a sponge, and the water of the world is just constantly being poured on you, and it's something that doesn't get spoken about near enough. I mean, these people are highly emotionally intelligent people, but they get called retarded, they get called learning disabled, they get called all sorts, don't they? Yeah. But actually, they're highly intuitive people. Put them in the House of Commons. They'll sort out who the real deal are and who the people that need to be sacked. Yeah. That's, I'm joking aside. So when it comes to grief, it's going to be powerful because they're already living in in a very powerful, emotionally connected state, really. I'd love to know what people in the spiritual world, I mean, community, would think of people like who live in assisted centre. I'd like to know their views on, like, you know, chakras and meridian lines and what these people are picking up. Some people have to, you know, go to Buddhist temples for years to get, you know, to merge with people. Do you understand what I mean? So it's quite but hopefully that long, it's almost another speech, but that
good.
explains the system. Are there any more questions from yourself or others?
For me, it was just, sorry,
carry on.
No, it was just a reflection really on what you said about kind of connection and kind of therapists kind of, you know, taking some time to get to know your son.
Yeah.
Because what we know about, you know, things like CBT is it takes a lot of effort and a lot of processing. It's largely a language-based kind of, you know, initiative.
I was a bit skeptical initially. Yeah,
it can be really tricky, can't it, to undertake with anybody, but particularly for somebody who's in kind of a highly kind of emotional state. They're not regulated enough to kind of engage in that. So connection is going to be key. I think, to helping him regulate, to be able to access that, you know.
I agree.
Trust as well. Trust. Yeah. In fact, I was absolutely bowled over. I'd done a speech many years ago in Crawley, and this was a social worker who remained nameless. She said, "What has trust got to do with anything?"
What?
She was earnest. She meant it. I don't know what was more shock, the question or the earnest question, but do you think I was picking up on her before she put her hand up? Yeah,
absolutely.
Yes. So when she said, I said, you know, I said simply, she didn't like it. I said, trust is everything.
Absolutely.
How the hell do you, what, you think you build up a relationship on no trust at all? That's quite an odd thing. Yeah, and it's power. I mean, I don't want to slate social work because I know they get, you know, their job is hard and it's quite, you know, in the media I don't want to offend people, but it's all down to you. It's not the job, it's who happens to be in the job. So who happens to be the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the social worker, because but they've got to be mindful, government and bodies, how that makes parents feel if they're having negative experiences time and time again with services. And I know Tally's going through a bit of a ropey situation, and it makes you, if you're not careful, it makes you lose faith.
Yes.
And then you have a mental health crisis, and then so when people talk about home wrecking, you do think of the worst, you know, people beating people up and that, but I think you can have indirect home wrecking where actually the home is being fragmented by existential forces. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you take all that home and then you talk to your husband or your partner, your children are picking up on it, so then it actually creates quite a powerful response. And I mean, I've heard some shot. I mean, a lady in Crawley again, just come up to me and said, "Oh, my GP said it's me that's the problem," and gave me a parenting pamphlet. I mean, this is what decade are we in? Autism isn't an attachment disorder, but that is more or less what the GP said. It's you better sort yourself out. Awful. So I think there's a bigger issue here. Obviously, we were talking about grief, but actually it's who you are, where you live, what your community is, who your friends are. It's every you know, when people say everything is connected, it is.
It is.
Every single thing is connected. So one negative experience lead on to another, to another, to another. And that is why parents get angry, and that's why people get angry, because it's like we live in a what we like to think is a I don't like this word, but we call it like a first world country. I mean, what is that? You know, the third world, we third world countries. awful hierarchical system that I was talking about. Well, actually, the third world system has got mental health right. They're closer to the earth. They have better communities, and that's why people are happier. And my dad told me a lovely story about an African tribe, who it was a tribe of 30, and one of their houses in their community got flooded and completely collapsed. You know what? The whole community banded together, rebuilt their home, and loved and cared for them. And this is what Tally and I agree with about these community roots. The feeling that if something terrible happened to you, someone would be there.
Yes.
That's what this is, the grassroots. This is all this government stuff about money. Yeah, money is important, but they've got to think about what the communities are suffering from. You never hear that, do you?
No, that's right.
Disillusionment, the fact that benefits cap, disillusionment that there's no community centres, disillusionment of not building an infrastructure and GP services around more housing. That's ridiculous. Why would you build loads of houses and then not rebuild your GP practice?
Yeah.
It's madness, isn't it?
Yeah.
So all those little things in the community that make people feel like, oh, I'm so tired, or just can't be bothered today. So if you going back to the system of sensing, everyone, those little sponges are just going to pick up and pick up. It's almost like taking on the world. In fact, when I went to therapy when I was very young, they done this association game with me, and it no surprise to me. One of the things the therapist noticed, he said, "Do you really think the whole world is on top of you?" And I said that I reasoned that out at 12 that it was. And the reason why I said that is because I was picking up on everyone's emotions, including the woman who was demanding me to kind of do this association thing, which I didn't want to do. I just done it because I was told to. So even from like 12, when my functional speech was more fluid, I was already being conscious that this system was there. I just didn't have a name for what it was. So hopefully that's all helped.
Absolutely, it has. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Fascinating, because Paul and I have long discussions where we could talk forever about the power of community and how we've lost that. And our aim is to rebuild that. And there's a project that Paul and I, and we're collecting people to start building communities up again, because we can help each other. And we seem to have lost that now. We seem to have all shut our doors, and we've forgotten about our neighbours. And what we want to do is build something where we care for each other, and we're with like-minded people, where we accept each other. And we were talking about how my son struggles going out because of exactly what Paul's been talking about. He picks up on other people's emotions and all sorts of stuff, but you put him somewhere where he's happy, where everybody understands him and accepts him, all of a sudden he's not having meltdowns, he's not having any episodes, he is just, the best version of himself. But we struggle with that because it's hard to find that.
Absolutely.
So watch this space. We're working on a big project, so hopefully soon we'll be able to launch it. It's just this whole thing with my son has got in the way. And,
oh, bless you.
It's just one battle after another, isn't it, for us? It's never ending. It's a lifelong battle that we have to do the best for our children, and but we'll get there. We will get there. We're determined. We've had some amazing chats, and we've got some fantastic people on board, so we'll keep you in touch with what we're doing, because we want to change everything, and we can do it because there's people like you guys who believe in what we believe in. So we just need to all get together and shout and say there is a better way.
Sounds great.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Paul. That was brilliant. Really, really good. And I think it's one I think we'll need to do again, because it's such a big subject. I think you could have spoken forever. I think when everybody brings in their own perspectives, I think it's more of a good to have almost like a workshop Q&A type thing, because
Yes,
everyone then, rather than, you know, just a talk, because everyone comes in with their own perspectives, their own points of view, their own maps of the world, and then Paul can then dip in and help you sort that out. So I think we will definitely do that again. Camin, thank you very much. Everybody's really enjoyed that. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, guys. That's been excellent. So we've got more talks coming up, and we will post them up online. Paul's got a whole load more. And don't forget the expo on the 25th of June at Brunel University. And hopefully, you know, we'll have Paul running a workshop there if he's able to come to do some stuff there for us. We'll have a chat about that, Paul. So thank you very much, everybody. Okay, have a lovely evening, everybody. Lovely to
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.